Hi and welcome back. Today I'm going to go over some of the ins and outs of planning and logistics of doing a long bikepacking trip. If you're new here, my name is Kyria, and in 2024, I quit my job to pursue a life of adventure and travel. And the first thing I decided to do was to ride across the US and Canada, but also do the Tour Divide race. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what I did as far as planning that trip, and then I'll also go over, in general, some of the accommodations, amenities, also what I learned after doing a long trip like that and what I liked and didn't like overall. Also, if you want more information, I have gone over the logistics of each section for most of them, and I can link those videos here, and also they will be down in the description below if you're interested in finding out more detail about any of this. Additionally, I'll link the entire playlist for last year's adventure and also put it here. So I started this route around the end of March, and I finished it around the end of November. So basically, I was on the road for, in the end, it was about 7.5 months, a little less. And I started in Grass Valley, California, and my route took me up through Oregon, Washington, and onto Vancouver Island. And then after that, I rode pretty much across Canada on the BC Epic 1000 to Fernie. From Fernie, I went up to Banff. And from Banff, I did the Tour Divide race from Banff down to the Mexican border. From there, what I did was I took an Amtrak actually from El Paso to Chicago, where I could start riding east again. The planning for this was interesting because I knew that there were a couple of things I definitely wanted to do. So what I kind of did was to start with the anchors. So I knew that I wanted to do the Tour Divide. That was the big anchor. So I put that in the calendar and then kind of worked backwards from there to figure out how long I would have to get to Banff. Now, of course, the timing doesn't always work out perfectly, so I actually ended up arriving in Canmore a little early. But after I had that anchor, I also started planning a few things with some friends. So for instance, I had some friends come to Canmore and stay for a week with me before the race. So since I knew the race was going to start on a certain day, I could plan that. So that's kind of how I did anything that I, had a known quantity or date for, then I worked around that. But basically, it was the Tour Divide was the main thing. And then I knew that I wanted to get to Nova Scotia, like ideally before the start of November, because I didn't really want to be fighting super cold nights, a lot of snow, and everything like that. Of course, in my mind, ideally, I was going to get there super early, and I was going to maybe even have time to ride down the eastern seaboard. So you dream and you plan a lot, and then like half of it doesn't even pan out. So just know that, but it's kind of fun to dream and plan anyway, so that doesn't really matter. Before I started off in March from California, we were actually having quite a dry year, and I was very hopeful that I would be able to go through the Sierra Nevada and be mostly on dirt. And those are places that I love. That's actually where I'm from. And so I was looking forward to seeing those areas from a different perspective. I've done a lot of hiking and, obviously driving through those areas, but being on a bike would have been a really fun thing to do. However, unfortunately, about a week before I was planning to leave, we got 12 feet of snow. So I kind of had to scramble right at the very beginning to change up my route to figure out what the alternatives were. And that's kind of basically set the tone for the whole trip because that's how it goes. The other thing was I had some friends that were going to be in Bend, Oregon at the beginning of April. So they had a date because it was the kids' spring break. So that was actually a second anchor that I was trying to make. So in my mind, I was going to go from Grass Valley in time to make it to Klamath Falls, where they were going to pick me up in the car on their way up to Bend, and we would spend a week in Bend, and then they would drop me back off in Klamath Falls. So that was kind of the other second thing that I wanted to do, definitely. However, like I said, somebody had something else in mind, and so I ended up having to go on the road through the towns of Oroville and Marysville and Red Bluff and Redding. So I kind of went along on the frontage roads near Highway 5, unfortunately. However, they were actually more pleasant than I thought they would be. So it wasn't as horrible as I anticipated. It's a lot of farmland. It's actually quite beautiful. And of course, it was the end of March, so it was becoming green, and there was still snow on the mountains that you could see around you. So it was quite pleasant, although it wasn't what I had planned. Of course, if you watched my video, you know that after I got to Redding, I headed up towards Burnie, and my idea was to go from Burnie to Klamath Falls, and hopefully on dirt again. I was really wanting to get back onto dirt, so I was kind of stubbornly trying to do that. However, on my way up to Burnie, I got snowed on and snowed in and had to come back to Redding to kind of regroup. And my friends picked me up there and we went to Bend from there instead of me getting all the way to Klamath Falls. That's just kind of a lesson that it's fun no matter what. Like, you're going to have a great story no matter what. It doesn't always have to go perfectly. But anyway, after that, I did the Oregon Outback, which was great because I didn't have to plan that. That's already a route you can download from the internet. And so that's kind of how it is. It was a few routes that I knew I wanted to try. And then I did my own planning between those routes. So Oregon Outback was a route. After that, it was the Great Northern Bikepacking Route. And then the BC Epic 1000, which also goes along the Great Northern Bikepacking Route. And from there, I just needed to get from Fernie to Banff. And my idea was that I was going to use the Great Divide or the Great Divide mountain biking route just to go from Fernie over Elk Pass into Banff. But again, I got foiled by the snow. I tried a secondary route. That also didn't work. After the Tour Divide, I did a lot of planning on my own and then using the Great Divide, the Great Northern Bikepacking Route. How did I get the maps uploaded and everything? I'm going to kind of do a whole video about how to plan a route, how to find routes, and how to download them and everything. But the short of it is that basically you can download it from usually Ride with GPS and put it on to Komoot, which is what I used most of the time, and then get it onto your bike computer as well. Same thing if you're building your own route, you can build your own route on Ride with GPS or Komoot, and then get it onto your bike computer as well. But like I said, I'm going to do a video that's a little bit more detailed about this because it does take a little bit of time and I'd like to walk you through it. So let's talk about amenities. The planning of the route often has to do with where you're going to sleep. And so a lot of times, or where you're going to eat, right? So a lot of times the way that I planned my route was based on how many days I was going to have to go before I could get a room or get a grocery store, go to a grocery store. And if you know me, if you watched any of my videos, you know that my fear, you pack your fears, is that I'm not going to have enough food. I don't know why. I'm not even that hungry all the time, but I just like to have like a little bit of a backup in case something bad happens. I'm like prepared for disaster at all times. So even though most of the time you go through a town or someplace you can get food, a gas station or whatever, probably almost every day in most cases, I still usually carry at least an extra day's worth of food with me. So I probably have about 2 days, maybe more in a pinch worth of food at any given time. And that's just something I've always done backpacking, because when I backpack, oftentimes it is literally in the middle of nowhere. And so you never know if you're going to, sprain your ankle or something like that. And so you want to have a little bit of extra food. So I think just that kind of training has caused me to always carry a little bit of extra food, no matter what. Even when I'm running, I carry my running vest, a couple of bars, because you never know. So if you're ever hungry when you're on the trail, I probably have food. I don't think that everybody needs to do this. This is just my own hang up, but it is what it is, right? But just as some fun facts, during this trip, which was about 222 days, I went to the grocery store 131 times, which basically is about every 1.5 days. I also dined out 130 times. Again, that's about every 1.5 days, but that does include beers, coffees, ice creams, lunch, dinner, breakfast, or snacks. So all in all, that would be about 261 times I got food at some point, which is over the amount of days. So I at least got food once a day in some capacity. Like I said, for the most part, in most areas, you're going to go past something at least once a day. There were a couple that were a little bit longer. The Oregon Outback, you basically only have one resupply. And so it took me about 6 days. So I went 3 days, resupplied 3 days. So you have to carry 3 days worth of food. Depending on how fast you ride, you might need more or less than that. The other one is during the Tour Divide, there were a couple sections that were kind of stark. For instance, like from Pinedale to Wamsutter, you do have Atlantic City in the middle that does have a little bit of a general store. And then you basically have 100 miles almost of the basin. And then even when you get to Wamsutter, it does have food, but it's literally like 2 truck stops. So it is food though. It is food. And they did have pizza actually. So the other one that was kind of a long one was right before Lima, Montana. There's a long stretch that was also longer than I thought it was going to be maybe. So maybe that's why it felt really long. But basically, once you go through Wind River to Lima is quite a long stretch. And if you want to get food, there's only one place that might or might not be open, or you have to go a little bit off trail to get it. So, there's a couple instances like that. But I would say 95% of the time, you're going to go through some kind of food thing once a day at least. As far as accommodation, this varied. So in California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and Alberta, there's actually, you go through quite a lot of either BLM land or Forest Service land in the US or Crown land in Canada. And the other thing is, in some of these places, you can just wild camp wherever you want, mostly on BLM land, Forest Service land, or Crown land. There's also some paid camping places, so BLM campsites actually, and then the recreation sites in British Columbia, which are very cheap. So you might pay $6 or $8 or something like that. They're very inexpensive. This is also the case pretty much for the Tour Divide. There's a lot of places where you are allowed to wild camp, and or the campsites are established but free or very cheap. However, in some places like Ontario or Quebec or Nova Scotia, there wasn't as much Crown land that I went through. There's Crown land, it's just a little bit further north than I was. And so my accommodations were a little bit more slim. There are also established campgrounds, but for one, I was there in the height of summer. But secondly, a lot of them are more geared towards RVs, at least in the areas that I went. So you would often be camping on like a little patch of grass with no trees and no picnic table, instead of where in British Columbia, for instance, or Montana, you're going to have a picnic table, you're going to have some trees, you're going to have a restroom that's nearby. Some of the RV ones in Ontario were a little bit lacking for a person in a tent. Also, as your trip gets longer and longer, I do find that it's a little bit, you get a little burnt out about putting your tent up and taking it down, or being in cold weather or rain or snow or whatever. And so I noticed, like, the further along my trip got, the more I was willing to say, oh, $80 for a motel, that sounds pretty good. So it definitely changes, your mindset changes as time goes by. The other thing I did, which really helped a lot, is one of my other anchors, or it was a very loose anchor, was that I was going to meet up with friends. So I stayed with friends in Vancouver. I stayed with friends near Toronto. I stayed with friends in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Nova Scotia and Portland. And so that kind of broke up the trip a little bit, which was really nice. And of course, it's a little bit less expensive, but it's also nice just to be with people and to have a hot shower and to have a real toilet and to be able to kind of dry out your stuff and regroup and, change your tires if you need to. So stuff like that. It really helps mentally, but also I saw more friends, like far-flung friends in my trip than I had for probably like the 5 years before that. So that was an added bonus. All right, let's talk about transportation a little bit. Before I did this trip, I had never taken my bike on a plane. In fact, that was probably the thing I was the most nervous about. Of course, any new thing, especially with a big clunky piece of gear and the possibility that you might not be able to get on. So like a bus, you never know if there's going to be space, or a train, you don't know if there's going to be space. You don't know if you have to box it up, or if you can put it on hold, or if you have to take the bags off or not take the bags off, or do you have to actually buy a ticket for it? Or there's a lot of, it's a lot of unknowns. And so I was pretty nervous about the plane and a little bit nervous about the trains, even though I had taken my bike on a train before. But for instance, in California, there's a commuter rail that goes from Oakland to Sacramento, and they allow bikes, quite a few bikes actually. However, you have to hang your bike up by the front wheel, and they don't allow anything over, I think, 2 inches. So if you have a mountain bike with 2.5-inch tires like I did, then basically you wouldn't be able to go on that car, and maybe no car. So there are restrictions for bigger tire sizes. So that does kind of narrow your options sometimes. And like via rail in Canada, I went from Quebec City to Halifax, no issues. I checked my bike like a bag into the guy at the counter, and they put it on the train for me. Whereas Amtrak, you had to put it on yourself or roll it over yourself, or maybe even box it up. So it really varied a lot from thing to thing. The other thing is, I just talked to a Canadian friend of mine who lives in Toronto, and he's trying to take his bike on Via Rail, and they're telling him he can't do it. So, I mean, sometimes it just depends on what agent you get. It's very frustrating, to be honest. The other thing is on ferries, sometimes you have a place to park your bike. Like when I took the ferry from Port Angeles to Victoria, you actually go on to the side and you go on first and you roll your bike into the front of, up on the deck of the front of the boat. And there's a bike parking. And then on some of them, like in Seattle, you go before the cars, but in the car lane. So sometimes you're in the pedestrian lane, like most of the ones in Canada are the pedestrian lane. So it really just depends. And sometimes you go first and sometimes they let you off last. And I mean, it's just a new experience every time. So that's the one thing I would say about transportation is just be prepared to be flexible because it might be different every time. And you might have to call twice and maybe get a different agent and get a different answer. So yeah, just be patient and flexible. As far as flying, it ended up being a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. I went and got a box. I put my bike in the box. I taped it up. I took it to the airport. It wasn't as hard to take the handlebars and move them sideways or, obviously I know how to take off the tire by now, but those things just weren't as hard as I thought. The anticipation of them was worse than actually doing them half the time. The other thing, which was kind of interesting and different, was border crossing. So I had never crossed a border with my bike before this. And so I did it, I think, about 8 times in the end. The first one, I took the Port Angeles ferry to Victoria, and then I crossed back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And each time, that's also a little bit different. So in some cases, you can go in the car lane. In some cases, you have to go in the pedestrian lane. I thought I would just kind of go over them real quick. I wrote them down, so I have to look at my notes. But just in case you're doing this same trip or any trip similar. So if you go from Port Angeles to Victoria on the ferry, you are going to have to walk off the boat and into a building with all the rest of the passengers and your bike. You go through the building with your bike. So you have a little desk that you have to go through customs, and you have to go into the building with your bike through customs. So then I crossed over near the town, I think it's Sumac, Washington. It's just west. It's just east of Vancouver. And in that case, I actually called the border crossing because I was a little nervous because I didn't know how it worked. And they told me I could either go in the car lane or the pedestrian lane. So I went into the pedestrian lane and I crossed through the building again with my bike in my hand. I pushed it through. However, when I crossed back from Washington to Canada, I think the town near there is called Abbotsford. Don't quote me on that. That one, I was like, oh, I'll go in the car lane this time. So I got in the car lane and they waved me over to the pedestrian lane. So they made me go through the pedestrian lane, but I had to leave my bike outside and go through customs, and then go get my bike and walk around. In the US, going from Canada to Eureka, Montana, I got in the car lane. Going back into Canada in Michigan at Sault Ste. Marie, I was in the car lane. Plus, you have to cross a bridge and pay a toll. I went back into the US at Buffalo at the Peace Bridge. And in that case, you go in the pedestrian lane, and it's quite strange. You actually go on the side of the bridge, and then you have to go into a little box, like an airlock, where you go into a door and then you have to go out a different door. But they don't let you out the second door until you go through customs, which is in a building, but it's just a little window, like a drive-in window. And there was nobody there, so you have to ring a buzzer. And you have to wait. And I waited like 10 or 15 minutes before a person finally came. And then they let you out of the second airlock. But of course, I have my bike, right? And you have to go through this big like swinging door with your bike, which is kind of difficult. That one was very complicated. So leaving Buffalo, going back into Canada, they actually make you go through the car lane, but there's a little side pedestrian area. So you go in the pedestrian area and then you're standing there, like there's like a sign, like when you walk into a restaurant, it says, please wait to be seated. It's kind of like that. And then they wave you over into one of the car lanes. So I actually had to cross over like 4 car lanes to get to the lane that was the next open lane that they were waving me to. So that was a little bit weird as well. So the last one was after I flew to Vancouver, I went from Vancouver down to Seattle area. And in that case, it was also the pedestrian lane. However, I had to cross over like 8 lanes of traffic to get my bike across all the traffic into the area where the pedestrians go. And again, they made me leave my bike outside, and I went in by myself and went through customs and then went and got my bike and left. So it really varies depending on where you are. And I don't know, it's not like every time you go into the US, it's one way, or out of the US, it's another. It's like a crapshoot. It's kind of fun. The one thing I'm really glad about is that everyone spoke English, because I can imagine if you're doing this in Serbia or something, it would be very confusing if they're telling you what to do, but you don't know what they're saying, or if they don't speak English, it would be a lot harder. So luckily, because it's different every time, they were speaking a language I could understand. So what was the best part? Well, I hate playing favorites, and I feel like it's trying to pick your favorite child or something. However, I would say that despite the fact that it was quite an adventure, there were some beautiful areas, and I did a bunch of things that I had never tried before, the best part was definitely the people. So whether it was like the random Harley rider that was at McDonald's having a coffee when I was there who stopped to talk to me, or there were a lot of old retired guys that I talked to for sure in McDonald's and Tim Hortons. That was my thing. I would go there and charge my electronics and have a coffee, and I always got to talking with some old retired guy. And it was great, though. I got to know the locals a little bit, got some inside information. I talked to the Harley guy about how your butt starts to hurt after you're sitting for a long time. So that was really fun. Also, there were people that, gave me food, gave me drinks, let me stay on their property, let me stay with them, like warm showers hosts who fed me and let me use their shower and showed me around. I stayed with a dairy farmer. He took me to the dairy farm and showed me how the operation worked and showed me all the animals on the farm. He had a llama and peacocks and all kinds of stuff. So I also went and stayed with several friends that I either hadn't met before in person or hadn't seen in a long time. And, I got to know them better and got to stay at their house. And I met new friends along the way. I met some people on the Tour Divide that I actually went and stayed with after that. And I also met some people on the Tour Divide that just really helped buoy my spirits when I was having a rough day, or, encourage me to keep going when I was feeling tired. So just all the people that I met along the way were definitely the highlight. And then you think, oh, I'm traveling solo, right? You're going to be lonely. Personally, I wasn't lonely. I know that other people have said that that's one thing that they don't like about doing solo bikepacking themselves, but I found that I met people everywhere. And I found that even just a little smile or a hello from somebody was enough to keep me going sometimes. So as you know, if you've watched any of my videos, I'm an introvert though, so I don't necessarily need to be around people all the time. So that can make a difference depending on what your personality type is. And don't get me wrong, there were some people that were rude, that didn't give me enough space, that honked at me, that splashed water on me through a puddle when I was on the side of the road. But I would say that they pale in comparison to the kindness of the people that I met along the way. So what was the hardest part? I would say the hardest part was mental rather than physical. So, despite being cold, if I'm riding in the snow, I can handle the cold, but I can't maybe handle the fear that I'm going to get lost or stranded. Or I can survive a 100-mile riding day, but wondering if I'm going to make it out of the Great Basin before I run out of water or it gets dark, that is a lot harder. I think overcoming those mental blocks can be difficult, but once you do, you get the reward, which is a feeling of pride in yourself and a sense of accomplishment. So what did I learn along the way? Well, I did a whole video about 10 things I learned kind of that are emotional, and I'll put it here. But I guess the short of it is that you learn a lot about how resilient you are, how capable you are, how far a smile or a kind word can go, and what it feels like to be uncomfortable most of the time. On the physical side, I know that I can keep going no matter how hard it is, even when my mental side is telling me to stop. Because that's another thing you learn is to ignore your mental side, because a lot of your time, your mental side is being a bit of a crybaby, and really you can just push through that. However, you do need to learn as well when you actually need to take a break. Of course, I also learned practical things like bike mechanics, and I learned a lot of things about the areas that I went through. I also learned that, just like you often do, that there are a lot of places that I didn't even know about, and so many more that I still don't know about that I would like to explore. Last but not least, there are a few things that I couldn't live without. Like, I think the most important thing to me is staying warm and dry. So my sleeping bag, my rain jacket, my rain pants, my tent, those things, obviously, you cannot live without. And of course, you can't live without your bike or your bike computer or your Garmin InReach. So I guess the answer to this question is that I don't think I really carried anything that was non-essential. Everything that I carried, I used, or it might be an emergency thing that I am glad I didn't have to use, but I would never not carry. Of course, two of the things that I did have to use that were emergency things were duct tape. The Gorilla one is really good. It's super sticky. So when my tent poles broke, I had to tape them up, and that actually held in the wind and the rain. And tenacious tape, which is kind of a clear tape that you can use to fix your tent or your rain jacket or any kind of more nylon type thing that you get a hole in. So those two things I carry all the time, and I used on this trip, and I've used many times before. The other thing I did use, I used spare brake pads, which more than one pair. I used my chain breaker, I used my extra rack bolts, and I used my tent splint. So all those little repair items are worth carrying around. Hopefully you never have to use them, but definitely essential. I also don't really feel like there was anything that I didn't have that I needed. So I did buy a few things along the way, like my system I had to hold my fork racks fell apart, so I had to buy some hose clamps to fix that kind of thing. I needed a new SD card for my GoPro. There are always things you're gonna find that you need along the way. However, I don't feel like I was underprepared in the beginning in any way. And of course, there are like dreams that I have about gear that I would like to have. You know, for instance, I don't have a dynamo hub. I think that would be great to have. And there's some other little things that I'm contemplating adding for the next trip. So that's pretty much it. I'd love to hear from you. If you've done a long bikepacking trip, what did you use to plan your route? What was the most essential thing you carried? And is there anything that you would do differently next time? Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, I'm going to be doing a Q&A. That's going to be the next video coming up. And if you have any questions, you can either leave them in the comments below, or you can put them on the post that I posted about asking for questions for Q&A, and I'll be sure to answer them soon. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. I have some interesting announcements coming in the Q&A where I'll talk a little bit about my upcoming plans. And I have some videos in the works that I think you're going to be excited about. So stay tuned. Thanks for watching, and happy trails.